With social media, you are renting an account on somebody else's server and you're playing by their rules. And we've seen how, in the past few years especially, how easy it is for people to get censored on social media. Basically, if they decide they don't like what you're saying, then your account can be shut off instantly. When you have your own website, it is a much higher bar to meet for a domain name to be shut down than it is for a social media account to be deactivated. Welcome to the Sovereign Computing Show, presented by ATL BitLab. I'm Jordan Bravo, and this is a podcast where we teach you how to take back control of your devices. Sovereign computing means you own your technology, not the other way around.
This episode is sponsored by ATL BitLab. ATL BitLab is Atlanta's Freedom Tech hackerspace. We have co-working desks, conference rooms, event space, maker tools, and tons of coffee. There is a very active community here in the lab. Every Wednesday night is Bitcoin night here in Atlanta. We also have meetups for cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, decentralized identity, product design, and more. We offer day passes and nomad passes for people who need to use the lab only occasionally, as well as memberships for people who plan to use the lab more regularly, such as myself. One of the best things about having a BitLab membership isn't the amenities, it's the people. Surrounding yourself with a community helps you learn faster and helps you build better. Your creativity becomes amplified when you work in this space. That's what I think, at least. If you're interested in becoming a member or supporting the space, please visit us at atlbitlab.com. That's atlbitlab.com. All right, on to our show.
Welcome to the Sovereign Computing Show. I'm Jordan Bravo, and I'm recording today from ATL BitLab here in the heart of Atlanta with Stephen DeLorme.
Sup?
And we want to remind you that you can boost into the show using the Fountain podcast app. You can find that at fountain.fm. You can also email the show. Our email address is sovereign@atlbitlab.com. And before we get into our main topic today, we're going to talk about an ongoing news event. And this is about something that's occurring in Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Core repo has a pull request on it, which means somebody is trying to add a change to Bitcoin. And that would be, in this case, Peter Todd, who is a well-known Bitcoin developer. And the name of this pull request is Remove Arbitrary Limit on Op Return Data Carrier Outputs. And what that means is currently there's the op return section of an output and there's a limit on it. And this proposes that that limit be removed. What is op return? Op return is a section in a Bitcoin transaction that data can be put into, arbitrary data, and it's not spendable, so it can be any kind of data. Typically, this is a message. For example, if you wanted to inscribe a message into a Bitcoin transaction, then you would put it in the op return. And the reason this op return standard or opcode was created was they wanted to give somewhere for somebody to put data unrelated to a transaction if they wanted to. And the justification was that people are going to do this anyway. A lot of people are, you might say, Bitcoin monetary maximalists would say the only reason to use Bitcoin to send a transaction is to actually move value from one address to another. But you have other people that want to use it to send arbitrary data, like putting messages onto the Bitcoin blockchain, putting JPEGs or anything else, any kind of other data unrelated to the transaction. And so since people are doing that, the reasoning was, might as well give them a place to do it that the nodes don't have to keep that data around forever and therefore accumulate a bunch of data that's gonna bloat the storage requirements. So at the time it was created, there was a limit put in place of how much data you could put in there. Now, this pull request is proposing to remove that limit. And my understanding for the reasoning behind it is that people are currently already getting around this and they're putting it in the transactions themselves with things like inscriptions. And these can be huge. You make the transaction really large. And because it's in the witness data, the Bitcoin nodes have to keep this data around. And it's just going to exponentially increase the storage requirements for a Bitcoin node. And so by removing the limits on the op return, you are giving them an alternative where they can put their inscriptions and their other kind of arbitrary data without putting it into the transaction itself that has to be kept. So, Stephen, did I nail that? Did I flub it? Is there anything that I'm missing there?
Yeah, I think that about covers it. Like a couple of finer points, I'll go ahead and say when op return was invented, people actually already were putting data on Bitcoin. I forget the name of the game or the project, whatever people were building, but it was like a kind of a problem that they were creating these unspendable outputs. That was the idea, that like the data they were storing on chain took the form of like outputs that were unspendable, and so that's why the op return was made. It's like, well, let's go ahead and make an if people are already doing this, let's make a way for them to do it that's like obviously provably unspendable, and that way people who don't want to keep the data can just throw it away. And you mentioned inscriptions. Also, one thing that's mentioned in the discussion for this is the Citria project, and some kind of watchtower thing that they're putting in transaction outputs, and it's unspendable. And so another kind of like finer point, getting into the Bitcoin weeds. I mean, this is I actually think the PR itself is very simple in terms of what it changes, but the concept and discussing it is incredibly difficult, because I don't even think it's consensus rules that are changing, it's standardness rules. It's just like, it's not even like changing anything about the consensus, it's changing anything about like whether nodes will add it to their mempool and broadcast it and share it with other nodes. And because it's so difficult to talk about, I think that's the reason why there's actually been a lot of kind of stress in the Bitcoin space over the past, week or so.
Would you say this is a controversial PR?
I would say it's a controversial PR. And in my personal opinion, I don't think it should be, but I can understand, because it is such a complicated issue to talk about, and it is nuanced. And look, people have different opinions on this, and really smart people disagree about this. If we've lost anybody, because there are some people listening to this who maybe are tuning in just to figure out how to be a little bit more private, or to give up a little more data. We did, cover running Bitcoin nodes and Lightning nodes on a previous episode. And I think the main takeaway from all of this, if you didn't understand any of the complicated, technical discussion, the main idea is that this is a change to the Bitcoin software, and kind of whether or not you agree with it or disagree with it, unless you're running your own node, you don't really get to have a choice or a say in it. Like, you can voice opinions and have discussion and all of that kind of stuff. But at the protocol layer for Bitcoin, if you're not running your own node, you don't really get a say at this process here. And so that's just another kind of angle to sovereign computing. I think sometimes we think about this stuff strictly as just like, well, my data and my privacy and all of that. But when you get into projects like Bitcoin and running your own Bitcoin node, that's actually kind of like what gives you a say to some degree, and the kinds of features and upgrades that Bitcoin undergoes.
So let's say I'm running my own node, and just for the sake of argument, I do not agree with, let's pose a hypothetical. Let's say that this PR gets merged and becomes a part of the next version of Bitcoin Core. We are currently on Bitcoin Core 28.1. Let's say it becomes part of 28.2. I'm not sure if that's actually going to be the version when it comes out, but let's just say it is. If I'm running my own node and I disagree with this decision and I do not want that limit to be removed on my node that I'm running, how would I prevent that?
That's pretty simple. You just wouldn't update to the latest version of Bitcoin Core. Simple as that. You just choose to remain on 28.1.
And I think it's worth pointing out that for this exact type of reason, Bitcoin Core is designed to not auto-update. In fact, you have to be pretty explicit about updating it, running the newest version, because when you run Bitcoin Core, you are telling the rest of the network, here's the set of rules that I agree to be a part of and propagate transactions for. And so if you were to have auto updates on Bitcoin, that would be a security vulnerability. That would actually be an attack vector where somebody could put in some kind of malicious update and then push it out to all the nodes that are auto-updating. So it's by design supposed to be a somewhat manual process so that you can decide for yourself if you want to upgrade to the next version.
Yeah, and even assuming there was no security backdoors or anything like that, it just feels kind of like in line with the Bitcoin ethos to that people should choose which node version they want to run. Because, at the end of the day, at the protocol level, the only true users are Bitcoin nodes. Those are the users of the Bitcoin protocol, the nodes themselves.
Right, and if you're not using your own Bitcoin node, then you're using somebody else's Bitcoin node, and you don't have any control over that. Tell us what you think of this topic. Do you find this to be a controversial PR? If it gets merged and is part of Bitcoin, are you going to upgrade your node? Are you going to stick with the current version? Do you think this takes away some of the sovereignty of node runners? Let us know. You can boost in and tell us with Fountain or another Podcasting 2.0 app, or you can email us at sovereign@atlbitlab.com. For today's main topic, we're going to talk about how to get a domain name as well as hosting in a private, self-sovereign manner, or at least as self-sovereign as domain names can be. I think that we should talk about that particular issue with the domain name system. The domain name system it's inherently centralized because there's a list of domain name registrars and the ICANN, which is the International Corporation
For Assigned Names and Numbers.
Thank you. International Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is the international body that regulates or partitions out domain names. And so ultimately, there is a central point of failure when it comes to domain names. However, there's also a huge spectrum of completely sovereign, which doesn't technically exist, but pretty sovereign and private with domain names, all the way to fully KYC'd and censorable. And we're going to talk about how we can get as far towards that self-sovereign spectrum as possible. When you register for a domain name, they might ask for everything from your real name, address, phone number, bank account, payment information, all the way to the minimum amount possible. And that's really what we're searching for here. That minimum amount is going to be an email address so that you can simply have an account. And for that, you can use an alias like Simple Login, which we've talked about in a previous episode. If you are unfamiliar with that, check out our episode on email and email privacy, and you'll get a whole bunch of good information on how to get started with that. And for payment, you want to look for something that accepts cryptocurrency, and specifically Bitcoin. We're fans of Bitcoin here, although some of them are going to accept Monero as well, and I would say that that's certainly a tool that can be used. Two examples that I want to talk about first for just straight domain name registration are NameCheap, that's namecheap.com, and I've been using this one for a long time. NameCheap was one of the first registrars to accept Bitcoin, and I have zero complaints about NameCheap. As the name implies, they are relatively cheap. I haven't seen anywhere that has better prices, so I think they have great prices. And when I register with NameCheap, I use the minimum amount of information possible. So the only thing that they have is my email address. Of course, I create a password to log into my account. My email address is an alias. And then when I go to pay, I select Bitcoin. I simply top up my account balance with Bitcoin, and then I can buy any of their products and services with it. And one thing I'll note is that they use BTC Pay Server. So they're not using some third-party KYC, Coinbase commerce type thing where it's using cryptocurrency supposedly, but really it's kind of just like, it's as bad as the legacy banking system in terms of tracking you and the data that you have to give up. So this one, I consider BTC Pay Server to be a legit sort of Bitcoin native way to pay for it. And they do indeed support that here.
I actually did not know that there were, like we were talking about before the show started, I was not even aware that there were domain name registrars that don't KYC, or not, I shouldn't say KYC, but that don't ask for lots of information. I guess I never considered it because I'm usually buying domains in a business context, and as a result, I don't kind of worry about it as much because I kind of just feel like, okay, business details are kind of doxed anyways, and so especially if you're public about your business. So I guess I never really thought about it. I just assumed this whole system had been fully captured.
Well, it's good to know that there's a way to do it in a much more private manner. And when you are filling out your information, you have to give out your name and address for the domain. Like once you're within your NameCheap account, I am not telling you to break any kind of laws, but nobody is going to blink twice if you put in fake information in there. So the name and address and all of that, just use a user generator website. Just look those up and you get a nice randomized name, address, and phone number. And then in addition to that, you want to utilize Domain Privacy Guard. NameCheap offers that for free. Many registrars also offer that as well. What that does is it offers you a layer of privacy between the public and that name, that information that you gave. Now, even though that you're putting in the fake information, it's still nice to have it so that if somebody is pinging your website from the public, they can't really glean. It'll just say domain by some privacy company, Privacy Guard or something like that. So that's what gives you a layer of privacy from the public. And then from the domain name registrar itself, that fake information that you're putting in there and lack of payment information is going to protect you from the registrar themselves, so that even if they were co-opted or forced to via court order, they would know nothing about you and they couldn't give you up. As far as censorship, yes, there is ultimately a way where a law enforcement organization could go to the domain name registrar, and if they had a court order, I'm not even sure what that process would look like. Maybe we can war game this out. Let's say some government agency wanted to censor a website and they were registered with very private details. How would they take them down?
Well, I think the simplest solution is if the domain name is registered with private details, if they want the website to go down, then that would just be as simple as, I think, just do they have a legally binding way to order the registrar to kind of halt that user's account? Like if the root name servers take down the A record and all the other DNS records, then the other DNS servers around the world, the records will eventually expire on their servers because they all have a time to live. They won't be able to refresh their DNS records from the root name server. So that's how I would see it happening. The web server, whatever the web server in question could still be running, and that doesn't really change or affect that in any way. But if you just attack the root domain name, I think that's a pretty quick way to make the website not work for 99% of people.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's two different areas that could be attacked. There's the name server, which is where you have a decentralized system of name servers all around the internet, and those tell users or anybody that's trying to reach the website what IP address to point to.
Yep.
Then you have the registrar itself, which says this account has registered this domain name, and therefore whatever settings they've put in their dashboard, whatever IP address they're pointing at, that's what we're going to honor.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The registrars are just kind of businesses that able to, sell particular domain names to users, but you have the root name servers that actually handle which, because you've got the name servers for any given domain name, right? So for atlbitlab.com, you can do a lookup, you can figure out what the name servers are, and the name servers host those DNS records. Those are the authoritative place where the IP addresses for that website can be found. But how do you find those name servers? Well, you have to get that information from the root name server. That's my understanding of it, at least. So yeah, you would either want to, I guess, attack the name servers themselves, or you'd have to tell the root name server to stop pointing to those name servers. But I'm not sure.
I wanted to mention a feature that many domain name registrars, including NameCheap, support, and that is DNSSEC. That's DNSSEC, and that stands for DNS security something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's basically what this does is it prevents another kind of attack, which is a domain name server spoofing or any kind of name server interruption or attack. Now, we've seen this before where organizations would go after domain name resolvers and name servers and put in different information so that even though a website was still up and running, users could not get to it because they would type in the domain name and it would point to a different server. And so you can actually mitigate that by ensuring you have DNSSEC enabled on your domain name.
That's really cool. I was looking for like a knowledge-based thing about it, but I think that's great. DNSSEC is awesome. I'm an advocate for it, and I did not know it supported it, so that's really cool.
Before we move on to hosting, which is a little bit of a different topic than domain names themselves, I wanted to shout out to a registrar called PorkBun. I've not personally used this one, but I've heard that they also support anonymous registration, and they accept Bitcoin as well.
This is the website right here?
Yep.
They have pigs all over their website.
Porkbun.com.
Yeah. Nice.
Let's move into hosting now, which is slightly different than the domain name itself. Hosting is a server where your website or application is actually going to run. And so your domain name and your hosting do not have to be on the same site. In fact, it's kind of nice to have them decoupled and be on different services. However, this next hosting provider that I'm going to talk about offers both hosting and domain names. In fact, a lot of service providers offer both because they want to make it convenient, like a one-stop shop. If I'm not super technical and I want to make a website for my church or my club or my home crafting shop, I might go to a single site and I want them to give me a domain name, host my website, and even build the website for me. So there's all-in-one providers, but I always think it's a good idea to have them separated out. However, this one that I'm recommending is a great provider. They're called Hostinger, and it's hostinger.com is the domain name. And I am currently using this for a VPS that I have. A VPS is a virtual private server, and this is basically your own Linux server in the cloud. And you can do pretty much anything with a VPS, from hosting a full-on application to a simple personal website. And what I like about Hostinger is that, again, they require only the minimal amount of information, just an email address, which you can use an alias for, and then you can pay in Bitcoin. And so I have a VPS that's running for a reverse proxy for all of my personal services. And as far as Hostinger knows, I'm just an account number. One thing you want to be aware of when you're connecting to your VPS provider is to make sure your VPN is enabled. That way you are obscuring your home IP address. And you can check out our previous Sovereign Computing episode on VPNs for more details on that.
Never heard of this. That's cool. Nice looking website.
Another hosting provider that has VPSs that you can pay in Bitcoin and stay anonymous is 1984.hosting. They're located in Iceland, which is famous for their privacy and digital sovereignty. They accept both Bitcoin and Monero. And again, they have good prices and minimal amount of information required.
Yeah, they're flying their Bitcoin and Monero flags pretty proudly on their homepage.
I love that. The last one I want to give a mention to is Flokinet. This is another Iceland service provider, and they have pretty cheap. 350 euros a month is a great price in my opinion. They also have VPSs and other types of hosting. And again, they will collect the minimum amount of data, which is just an email address, and they allow you to pay in Bitcoin.
That's cool.
We talked about hosting providers and we talked about domain name providers. Is there anything else you can think of when it comes to getting a website up and running? Maybe we could talk about reasons you would want to even do that in the first place, servers, etc.
Well, I mean, that's actually a good question in the modern age, because I think a lot of the narrative publicly has just shifted to social media. And a lot of times, I think websites are great. I think having a homepage is great. I think it's kind of like your static, fixed place on the internet. It's really nice if you have your personal website, and even if you don't have like a product or a business or something professional you want to do with it, it's kind of fun that you get to have your personal site that is kind of constructed the way you like it to be. And I think we kind of lost that magic a little bit. That was like a fun thing in the 90s and early 2000s to be able to like have your personal homepage. And even if it was, it could be, there are people who may like, this is my shrine to whatever Dragon Ball Z character page. And then, you'd have other people just like, here's some of my favorite bands and my favorite books. And it's like, I don't know, that all feels very quaint now, but there was something kind of magical about that everybody had their little home on the internet. And I think, I kind of wish that we'd bring some more of that back. A lot of people have just pivoted to social media, which is fine, but it's something different, social media, and you don't really control it. And there's nothing really that feels fixed and permanent about it. And there's, of course, attempts like, Nostr and stuff like that to try and decentralize that. But I think there's something kind of beautiful just about having your own website. Then having said that, there's also, what if you want to run your own business or run a website for, your club, your church, your company, whatever it is. So these are good skills to be able to have. As always, I think it's just nice to be kind of liberated from the big service providers. A lot of times when you get onto plans with like a software company, a lot of your decision making, I think, revolves around like, what plan do I need to be on, and like how many transactions or how many pages do I get, or how many products can I add to this store? And a lot of times when you're able to, host your own website, you don't have that kind of concern. Like, for example, if like I see on, did they mention on Floki? Yeah, like, okay, I don't know about this one, but one of them mentioned WordPress, right? So like 1984 .hosting mentions WordPress on their page. And if you want to go and sell something online and you go to like Big Cartel or Shopify or whatever other website, it's going to be like, well, $30 a month minimum for your store, or this % in transaction fees, or like you can list up to 10 products on the free plan, right? I'm not saying that's exactly what their business model is. I've seen that a lot of times with e-commerce hosting providers. It's a very common thing. And I think that factors into your decision making. Whereas if you just like went to one of these web hosts, deployed a WordPress store, set up WooCommerce, you could get a proof of concept website up and running very quickly, and hook that up to like a free Stripe account for credit cards, or like point it to your BTC Pay server for Bitcoin. And then you have maximum freedom because you're in the like WordPress open source ecosystem, and it gets a lot of shade thrown at it these days, but it has a huge, powerful plugin ecosystem. Like, there's a lot that you can do that if you want to try and do with platforms like Webflow and all these other centralized platforms, you just have to pay an arm and a leg for a lot of the basic features and stuff. So I don't know, that was kind of a rant, but I just, I think there's something beautiful about personal websites that I wish we would bring back. And I also think that, you have maximum amount of freedom when you think about hosting your own website.
Agreed on all those points, and sort of building on top of that, with social media, you are renting an account on somebody else's server and you're playing by their rules. And we've seen how, in the past few years especially, how easy it is for people to get censored on social media. Basically, if they decide they don't like what you're saying, then your account can be shut off instantly. When you have your own website, while we talked about it's because of the domain name system is ultimately centralized, it is a much higher barrier or a much higher bar to meet for a domain name to be shut down than it is for a social media account to be deactivated. So in order for it's very rare that you would know anybody that's actually had a website domain name taken down by some federal authorities, right? Like they often have to go to a federal level and sometimes even an international level, depending on the registrar or the registry. And this is like, in order for them to disrupt registrar's business like that, they have to have a legit cause. Typically, if you're just saying some mean stuff on your website or something that the other people disagree with, they're not going to be able to get your website shut down from the domain name level. So this is a much higher level of self-sovereignty and ownership over your whole stack. So you have the lower censorship. You also have the greater permanence. As you mentioned, you can have your website around forever, whereas social media comes and goes. And then you'll have something convenient, like there's actually, have you heard about LinkTree, Stephen?
I know, yes, I have.
Yeah, so LinkTree, it's kind of fun to laugh at the fact that this site is so popular, but LinkTree is just a website that you can list your various links. So it's like, oh, here's my Twitter and my Instagram and my Facebook, blah, blah, blah. And just to find all of that, go to LinkTree. So you only have to remember one thing. Well, if you have your own website, you don't need a LinkTree. You know, I could have jordanbravo.com and I could say, go to jordanbravo.com to contact me. And it'll have my email address and all the other ways that you can contact me. Whereas if I didn't have my own website, I would say, go to LinkTree and then search for Jordan Bravo, and oh shoot, somebody else already claimed that. So here's a 1 after my name. And you know, it's much less professional, and you absolutely do not own it in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, LinkTree is like, wow. I mean, like, maybe this is like a side tangent, but as someone who's grown up with the web, it's like infuriating to me to see like, not infuriating, just frustrating. I don't always understand it. These experiences that like limit what we can do, but become so popular. And so like Instagram is one of those. It's like, I see artists and photographers and, you know, any kind of content creator basically like conforming to the, you know, squarish aspect ratio of Instagram because, you know, well, it has to fit on Instagram, and like arranging things so that they're spaced out and look a certain way in your feed. So it's like their work is now being dictated by the feed on Instagram, versus with a website, you have this whole canvas to work with and you can arrange things however you want. And it's the same with LinkTree. It's like, if you want to have a personal homepage, like that's what this is. This is like your home on the web. It's like your personal homepage. Here's all of the stuff that I'm involved in. But all it is a page with like 3 or 4 links on it. And it's like, so this is something like people pay for this? Like people pay for a service that lets you make what at its core is essentially just an HTML file with 3 links in it. I mean, I get it. Like we're looking at the page here. There's like some pretty stuff. You can style it for your, you know, unique Gen Z personality. Okay, I get that. But like, it's just weird the fact that we're paying like all this money just for a page with like a couple of links on it. Like that's like how just like centralized the web has become, and it's weird.
I agree. I appreciate the rant. That's kind of what I was alluding to, and I'm glad you said it the way you said it. One last thing I'd point out when you have your own domain name is we talked about in the episode on email addresses, how to decouple your email address and really take ownership and sovereignty over that. And in order to do that, you really need your own domain name. And so by having your own domain name, you have the power to have your own website. You have the power to have your own email address with an infinite number of email names at that address, inboxes, you could say. So it really gives you, it kind of makes you a a citizen of the internet rather than a serf of the internet.
Sounds good to me. Jordan and I got off on a side tangent that we think that many of you are going to find very interesting, especially if you're curious about how this technology works, curious about failure scenarios with domain names and all of that. But we've moved it to the end of the conversation so that we were able to get through all of the product suggestions and all that at the beginning. So if you're interested to really, really dive deep and get into some interesting territory, keep listening.
I think it's worth talking this through a little bit because the way that the domain name system works, I'm actually asking this now because I've never thought about this exact part of it, which is how does ICANN apportion domain names to registrars? And then how is control or ownership of it transferred? For example, to a registrar and then from a registrar to a user.
I don't know. Should we ask Maple?
I think we could do that. And we may or may not want to edit this.
Yeah. And to me, how ICANN and registrars interoperate. For example, if registrar A provisions example.com to Alice, how does registrar, I can't type right now, how does registrar B how do we prevent registrar B from also provisioning example.com to Bob? And this is also like a llama model that I think doesn't have access to the open internet, but this is also like knowledge that's been around for a while, so it wouldn't surprise me if it's been. So ICANN and registrars interoperate through a system that ensures uniqueness of domain name registrations across different registrars. Here's a simplified overview of the process. ICANN is responsible for managing the global domain name system and ensuring that each domain name is unique. ICANN maintains a centralized database known as the root zone, which contains the authoritative records for all top-level domains, such as .com, .org, and .net. Registries. For each TLD, there is a corresponding registry that manages the domain name registrations within that TLD. For example, VeriSign is the registry for .com and .net. Registries are responsible for maintaining the authoritative database for their respective TLDs. Registrars. Registrars, such as Registrar A and B, are accredited by ICANN to sell domain name registrations to customers like Alice and Bob. Registrars interact with the registries to provision and manage domain name registrations. To prevent duplicate registrations, such as Reg B provisioning example.com to Bob when it's already registered to Alice through A, the following mechanisms are in place. EPP, Extensible Provisioning Protocol, that's a mouthful. Registrars use EPP to communicate with the registry for their respective TLD. When a registrar attempts to register a domain name, they send an EPP request to the registry. The registry checks if the domain name is available, and if so, it creates a new registration record. Registry lock. When a registrar successfully registers a domain name, the registry locks the domain name to prevent other registrars from registering it. This lock is implemented through the EPP protocol. Whois database. Each registry maintains a Whois database that contains information about registered domain names, including the registrar record, registrant contact information, and name server details. So it sounds like, okay, so this flow is probably a good description. Registrar A sends an EPP request to the .com registry. The registry checks if example.com is available, and if so, creates a new registration record. The registry locks example.com to prevent other registrars from registering it. Got it. So basically, it looks like there's just this kind of database called the registry, and all the registrars have to talk to this registry to see if it's available or not. And the root name server, the registry, I'm assuming that the registry is the one that controls the root like name, authoritative name server for .com, .net, whatever your TLD is.
VeriSign in the case of .com, it says. Can you ask it one more question?
Yeah.
Say, if some authorities such as the FBI wanted to take down a domain name, how would they go about it, and where are the points of failure?
So if an authority like the FBI wants to take down a domain, they coordinate with various stakeholders. Identification and investigation. FBI identifies the domain name in question, conducts an investigation to gather evidence of illicit activities. Obtaining a court order. The FBI obtains a court order that warrants them to seize or suspend the domain. U.S. federal court issues this. Notify the registrar. FBI notifies the registrar of record for the domain, GoDaddy, NameCheap, etc., provides them with the court order. Registrar's response. The registrar will typically comply with the court order by suspending the domain name, making it inaccessible to the public. And then the registrar will transfer the domain name to a holding account or a new registrar, effectively taking control of the domain. And then they update the who has records to reflect the change in status. And I'm assuming that happens through that EPP protocol that was discussed from the previous one. Registry involvement. If the registrar is unable to take action, or if the domain name is registered with a registrar that is not cooperative, the FBI may need to involve the registry. That would be VeriSign for .coms. So the registry can then update the root zone and who has records to reflect the suspension or transfer of the domain name. And then name server updates. The FBI may also need to update the name server records for the domain name to point a new IP address or a holding page. So yeah.
This is cool, these points of failure.
Points of failure. Non-cooperative registrars. So yeah, obviously that would prevent the FBI from taking it down. Domain name proxy services. If the domain name is registered through a proxy service, it may be more challenging for the FBI to identify the true owner of the domain and take action. Yeah, I think a caveat on that is just because the human is proxied, if they want the website to be taken down, you could still ask the registry to take it down.
Right. That with number one, non-cooperative registrars, it says if the registrar is not based in the US or is not willing to comply with the order, the FBI may face difficulties in taking down the domain name. That's the one that intrigues me because I'm thinking there's got to be registrars in different jurisdictions that are attractive for privacy-minded people who, they're going to be the same way you have jurisdictional arbitrage. You have some jurisdictions that are more favorable for privacy. I would guess that there are certain domain name registrars in different jurisdictions that might have a little more backbone when it comes to standing up against takedown orders.
Yeah, and it could be the case. I think it's interesting because, a lot of times it's so easy to buy domain names these days, and we have so many TLDs to choose from, but kind of a different level of service from different TLDs. So for example, .com is the most ubiquitous, and they're a little bit pricey these days, and a lot of the good ones have been taken, but I've found a pretty flat, consistent level of service with those. But then, you'll run into some that have special considerations. Like, I think for .movie, you need to prove that you have a film in distribution. .film you can get pretty liberally, but .movie I think requires more, stuff. Or .dev is supposed to be for developer related stuff. I don't know if Google runs that one. I don't know if they've ever taken anybody down, but it's reserved for that. It's also one of the pricier ones too. .app is incredibly pricey because it's so desirable. People with SaaS software, startups want that .app domain and are willing to, pay a premium for it. But then you get into stuff like the .io, and did we talk about that on another episode or something? That .io is the famous,
Indian Ocean.
Yeah, is that what it is? Indian Ocean? I was saying is the famous technology website.
We talked about that, but I don't think it was on an episode.
Okay, but yeah, so the .io, it's in the 2010s. It was every cool developer project had a .io domain name. It just it was your way of signaling you're in the tech industry or whatever.
Input output.
Yeah, I guess so. But the thing about it was that, there was some, issue recently where the registrar was going down or something like that.
I think what happened was, last year, maybe 2024, 2023, but there was a change in jurisdiction because whatever country the .io name was part of, it was previously a British colony or territory, something like that. And then that territory or colony got its independence or some kind of change in the jurisdiction of no longer being under that British authority. And so there was a new whole jurisdictional system for them, and therefore the domain name now was going to a new owner, so to speak, a new authority, and that authority did not have to honor the existing domain names. So I didn't follow what ended up happening with that, but there were kind of two possibilities. One was going forward, they would continue to honor existing domain name registrations, and it would just sort of go on as usual. And the other was like they would just say, no, we're starting over with .io domains.
Yeah, and so I guess, we'll have to check the status of that later, but the point with that is that it was a scare. Like, there can be these interruptions in service, especially when you're dealing with like a registrar in like some colony out in the ocean or whatever. Like, it's just not the same. It's like having a .com through Verisign. Another example is XYZ. This has become the new hip tech project name to have like your website ending in .xyz. But this was actually an issue in the Fediment community because there were people trying to start federations, which are kind of like these community Bitcoin banks, to put it succinctly. And some federations had started, and the guardians of those federations, the people who, like the node runners who kind of run the bank, they had .xyz domain names for their guardian nodes. And some of the guardians went down because for some reason the XYZ domain register, I guess it was the XYZ registry, or I don't know what step in the process this happened, but a bunch of XYZ domain names got taken down. It was actually this huge kerfluffle in Fediment, and the Fediment team eventually, created a fix for the problem, and so those guardians were able to get back up and running under different domain names. But it is a problem, so it's like you go through a .com domain name, and I think it's a very stable, robust, steady level of service, but you are kind of in the system, so to speak. You can go through these other TLDs that go through other countries and stuff, and the regulations, requirements may be a little bit different for those, but there's also kind of like this risk of what if something happens with that TLD? Not saying you shouldn't use those, it's just there's trade-offs.
All right. Now, why are we even talking about this? Are we trying to foment a revolution where the FBI is going to come after us and our listeners and take down our websites? Probably not. However, it's one of many steps in building up our sovereign computing life, our digital fortress. And each of these steps by themselves is not make or break, do or die, but it's layers of security and privacy that build a solid foundation. All right, let's read some boosts. We got a boost from Clockwork for 500 sats, and I believe that was on the episode of...
I think it was on the show itself.
On the show itself. All right. Well, thank you, Clockwork. We appreciate your boost.
A silent boost.
Silent boost, just no message, just appreciate your support there. And then we also got some streaming sats from Weird Robot. So thank you, Weird Robot. 1,200 sats were streamed in. We really appreciate that. Appreciate the support and that you're listening. Remember, if any of you would like to support the show, you can boost in or stream sats with an app like Fountain. You can also email us. Our email address is sovereign@atlbitlab.com. And stay tuned for more ways to contact us in the future. We're going to be adding a matrix room anytime soon. We've been teasing that for a while, and we promise you it is coming soon. TM, that's trademark for soon. Anything else you want to cover today, Stephen?
I think I'm good.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Catch you later.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about anything that we discussed, you can look for links in the show notes. That should be in your podcast player, or you can go to atlbitlab.com/podcast. On a final note, if you found this information useful and you want to help support us, you can always send us a tip in Bitcoin. Your support really helps it so that we can keep bringing you content like this. All right, catch you later.